Okay, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here. This is part of the interdisciplinary aspect of this conference, I think, because all of us presenting here in this panel and also a panel on Sunday, we're from the Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Women's University, so not the education department, but we do also have interests in education, especially education as a right and education and its role of creating citizens that are better able to contribute to society, are better able to look after their own rights and their rights of their fellow citizens. So as Joe mentioned, very much tied in with the keynote speech. So I'm going to talk about education for resilience, in particular looking at the power of education to decrease the threat to vulnerable individuals and groups posed by natural disasters. If I have time, which I probably won't, I will also talk about refugee education. But just in case I run out of time about refugee education, maybe we can discuss that afterwards. So as I mentioned, the starting point for my presentation, and indeed for this panel, is that education is a normative human right, but it also serves a practical function of improving domestic and international governance performance. I forgot to click, so I'll click now. So the evolution of human security has focused on the three pillars of human right to live one's life free from fear, to live one's life free from want, and to live one's life with dignity. As will be developed by some of our other speakers today, education can contribute significantly to each of these pillars. My presentation will focus on the right of the most vulnerable, the local, the subaltern, the marginalized, but also why it be in the self-interest of those who govern to support these rights to education. So concurrent with the rights to education and training and information, concurrent governance responsibilities of those who govern towards those over whom they exert authority, at whatever level of governance that means. In terms of freedom from fear, these have most clearly been spelled out in the responsibility to protect paradigm, wherein all governments are obliged to protect their citizens from the four international crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The international community has obligations to become involved, to not be a passive bystander, when a national government is unwilling or unable to prevent these crimes, or indeed if the government itself is perpetrating these crimes. In terms of freedom from want, this has been addressed by the basic human needs debate within the development paradigm. I know one of IAFOR's other conferences focuses on education and development, and this features quite highly in there. But certainly, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, which contain extensive reference to education entitlement. In terms of living with dignity, this has come to be closely linked with capacity building and agency. So those who govern have an obligation to provide conditions of peace and security, to reconcile conflicting interests, to generate collective good, but also to empower citizens to secure these things for themselves. So education and training are key to these normative agendas in governance policymaking. Unfortunately, top-down national policies often exclude the marginalized and vulnerable populations. This is not only a violation of international norms, but due to the intersectorality of security concerns, could ultimately undermine national interest and security. So I'm going to first consider the impact of education and training, or its lack, on social capital and societal resilience in the face of natural or given the role of human agency, maybe just nature-induced disasters. And then I'm going to look at the key role of education for stateless persons and refugees, if I have time. Again, probably not, but we'll address it as we come to it. So, first of all, disaster resilience. I'm going to address a couple of case studies where the lack of societal training exacerbated the impact of natural disasters. First of all, Myanmar and Cyclone Nargis. In terms of natural disasters, the focus of the literature and governance policy making has been on reducing vulnerability to natural hazards through building resilience rather than developing infrastructure. But in Myanmar, under the previous military administration in Myanmar, the government focused on national security, military dominance, national solidarity, rather than the protection of citizens. And this distorted budgetary allocations, leaving little for human-centered development or educational development and resilience building. Even during the brief period of democratic governance, there was still a military distortion of the budget. So Myanmar has consistently allocated around 25% of the national budget directly to the military, and a lot more than that indirectly is siphoned off through military ownership, what's been referred to as khaki capitalism. The education sector receives less than 7% of the national budget. The health sector, less than 4%. The Ministry of Social Welfare, Relief and Resettlement, which is responsible for disaster relief and resilience, receives 0.07% of the national budget. But that's actually a big improvement. You'd be shocked to hear that this is more than 20 times the 0.003% of the national budget it was receiving at the time of the biggest disaster to hit the country, Cyclone Nargis, in 2008, which affected more than 50 towns, left more than 140,000 people dead, 2.4 million people made more vulnerable by loss of property and livelihoods. And the underlying governance failures and long-term trends leading up to Nargis had left the country and its citizens even more vulnerable to the devastating impact of the storm than might have otherwise been the case. And this was due extensively to the military prioritization. Myanmar was left particularly deficient in basic services, which contributed to a lack of disaster risk reduction. A lack of preparedness at the national government level was compounded by insufficient resilience education at the provincial level. As a result, necessary evacuations just didn't take place. Indeed, post-disaster analysis identified the main cause of the severity of the tragedy as being a lack of awareness of the danger, of how to prepare and when or where to evacuate. This was further compounded by a lack of agency in civil society. When civil society actors tried to do something, tried not to be bystanders, tried to take charge as first responders, they were actually arrested for acting without authorization. Finally, social capital, which relates to the amount of trust communities have in authorities, proved horribly insufficient in Myanmar during Cyclone Nargis. Because even when belatedly the government actors took to warning the people of the impending disaster, the people just didn't believe them because they were just used to lies from the government. Social capital is also very important in the second case study, disaster resilience in the Philippines. The importance of social capital for resilience in the face of natural disasters can be analyzed by comparing a couple of disasters in the Philippines where there's a different level of social capital. So vulnerability to natural disasters is a result of a whole range of economic, social, cultural, institutional, and political factors that shape people's lives and create the environment within which they live and work. The environment and conditions for the impact of two Category 5 typhoons, Yolanda in 2013 and Glenda in 2014, were essentially very similar. Obviously, both in the Philippines, both similar levels of development, etc. But the loss of life was dramatically different. Almost 6,000 people were killed by Yolanda. One death was attributed to Glenda. So how can we explain this dramatic difference? Well, the explanatory variable for this difference can be found in differing levels of social capital. Social capital plays a vital role in reducing disaster risk. When disasters occur, human, economic, physical, environmental capital is destroyed or damaged. Social capital is not reduced by the impact of disasters, but can actually grow during the disaster. Social capital can help give community members access to various resources during the disaster management cycle. Before a disaster, it facilitates warning, information exchange, shelter preparation, and pre-positioning of supplies. During a disaster, social capital helps threatened communities to make better evacuation decisions, initiate debris removal, provide care, etc. Now, in the case of the impact of Glenda, 83% of the population fully and 17% highly recognized and trusted the work and efforts by local government units to help reduce disaster risk. So a very high measurement of social capital. By contrast, the population impacted by Yolanda, 72% of interviewees rated that local government units' efforts were barely or not working at all. Communities' level of recognition and trust towards local government units directly relates to the acceptance of early warning messages and evacuation orders from local government units. Regular communications and close contacts from LGUs, including through resilience training and education, enabled LGUs to earn the trust from the local community. When this was absent, DRR efforts, disaster risk reduction efforts, were neither well appreciated nor trusted by the communities. So when the disaster struck, LGUs had limited influence on persuading communities to follow their instructions and evacuate. So clearly it's incredibly important to build resilient societies, and doing that, you need to contribute to education about the impact of disasters, but also by providing the education, you build the trust, which builds social capital, which means that the populations will listen to advice from trusted sources. I'm probably out of time, so I think I'm not going to have time to deal with refugee rights and obstacles to refugees receiving education. We can talk about that during the break if you like. But just zipping on to the conclusion, why governments need to care. Securing education rights is critical not only for refugees' self-empowerment, but also for the peaceful development of communities. The refugees can become productive members of society, less of a drain on society, especially in countries with demographic challenges such as South Korea and Japan, where they can contribute tremendously if sufficiently empowered. So education provision for refugees and other marginalized communities represents a noble opportunity for those who govern. If the focus remains only on freedom from fear and freedom from want, without taking the further step to freedom to live in dignity through self-reliance, agency, and empowerment, vulnerable individuals could still fall prey to unscrupulous political entrepreneurs and agitators. So refugee and migrant populations could yet provide fertile ground for religious extremism, terrorism, and crime, threatening national and international security. So it's in the self-interest of those who govern to provide education. So everyone has a right to education, including marginalized communities. Education can impact positively on all pillars of human security and good governance. All states have concurrent obligations related to the provision of education and training for their societies. But it's also in the rational self-interest of statesmen to provide education and training for these groups. So thank you very much. It's now my great honor to pass the baton to the second member of our team here, Professor Aurel, who is making his way to the stage now. Now, Professor Croissant, in addition to his appointment to Ewha Women's University, is also a very senior scholar at the University of Heidelberg, where still currently the dean. So from one dean to another, I'll pass you on to Professor Croissant.
Okay, welcome. Thanks so much for showing up to this panel discussion and presentation. My name is Aurel Croissant. I'm based at Heidelberg University and also at Ewha Women's University. And today I'm going to present first findings of an ongoing research project that deals primarily with democratic backsliding. And within the context of that project, I also looked at civic education systems and political polarization. I'm going to compare 3 cases that represent 3 different levels of polarization, 3 different trajectories of democratic development, and 3 different systems of civic education. But what they all have in common is that in recent years, fears of political polarization and its contribution to democratic backsliding have increased very much in all 3 countries. And as these fears about political polarization have increased, many scholars have asked, what's the role of civic education? Can civic education contribute to countering polarization or to preventing or depolarize polarization and depolarize societies? My presentation will proceed in 5 steps, and I'm sure I will run out of time, so I will cut it short then. I will first talk a little bit about polarization. How polarized are these 3 countries? We are in the land of smile, but Thailand is one of the most politically polarized societies in the world, at least according to the data I'm using. It's almost like in the United States of America. Number 2, I'm talking a little bit about democratic backsliding, and then about civic education systems, civic education and polarization, and then I try to wrap up my presentation with a few conclusions. So let me begin with polarization. The question is, of course, how do we define polarization? How do we measure polarization? I adopt the definition of political polarization suggested by the Sweden-based Varieties of Democracy project, VDEM project. You may have heard about it. And their definition refers to the extent to which political differences affect social relationships beyond political discussions. So societies are highly polarized if supporters of opposing political camps are reluctant to engage in friendly interactions, for example, in family functions, civic associations, their free time activities, and workplaces. So that's often called pernicious polarization in the US debate, for example. Polarization is not necessarily a bad thing for democracy, I would argue, because in pluralist societies, a certain amount of differences in opinions and worldviews is just defining part of pluralist democracy. But if polarization becomes too strong, pernicious polarization emerges, then of course democracy is in threat, because you cannot have democratic debates if you view the opponent not as an opponent or competitor, but as an enemy and antagonist. To examine polarization in South Korea, Thailand, and Germany, I used a VDEM data set, and this is expert-coded data. We can talk about it in the discussion. And this expert-coded data measures the extent to which a society is polarized on a scale from 0, not at all, to 4, to a large extent. And as you see, the findings are not really encouraging. All 3 societies are perceived as increasingly polarized on political issues. Of course, there are important differences between the cases. The level of polarization is very different. The type of polarization is very different. In Thailand, it's basically, in my understanding, if I may, it's basically political polarization between 2 antagonistic views of society, state, and nation. In South Korea, it's more a polarization between political parties, but not so much societal polarization. And in Germany, polarization is a more recent phenomenon, at least in this time period, but it's increasingly a polarization between the far right and the rest. So it's not a polarization with a strong left and a strong right wing pole in the political spectrum. It's more the right wing versus the rest. Different levels of polarization also correlate with different levels of democratic backsliding and democratic development. As you see here, this is again VDEM data. It measures the level of democracy on a scale from 0 to 1. Higher scores suggest higher level of democraticness. And here the model of democracy is liberal democracy, rule of law, minority rights, plus political competition. And you see that Germany, according to this data, is the most democratic system among the three. It's not the most democratic system on the planet. That's as usually Scandinavia. Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, they must be paradise on earth because in pretty much every democracy index, they score very, very high. But you see, there is a small but substantial decline in recent years. It's a small decline, but it's substantial. Then South Korea is in kind of a middle position. As you see, it experienced some extent of democratic backsliding in the 2000s and 2010s under two conservative presidencies, but has recovered in recent years. And Thailand, as you are all aware of, is a tragic case of a fragile, regularly collapsing and then re-democratizing political system with two military coups in the 2000s and 2010. So we have very different trends in democratic development, which correlate to some extent with polarization, and we can discuss later on in the Q&A. And of course, there are causal connections between polarization and democratic backsliding in all three countries. So let me briefly talk about the civic education systems. Careto, Hester, and Bermudez propose 4 elements that are essential to civic education. First, civic understanding. Second, civic skills. Third, civic values, motivations, and identity. And fourth and final, civic action. Germany, South Korea, and Thailand all three countries have considerable experience with civic education. Although understandings, practices, and goals vary greatly. In Thailand and Korea, civics is delivered through compulsory school subjects via direct policy actions. This is, of course, also relevant in Germany, but in Germany it's a multi-layered system with a very substantial non-governmental extracurricular political education that is much more significant in Germany than in the 2 Asian countries. The teaching of civic education in Thailand varied over the time greatly in terms of ideology the state wanted to instill in Thai people. Civics curricula are strongly influenced by Buddhism and the monarchy and promote what is viewed as the 3 national values: nation, religion, and king. Despite well-intentioned efforts by reform-minded educators in recent decades, much of the routine practices in Thai schools continue to socialize young people into accepting uncritical patriotism, authoritarian control, and dutifulness. We heard a little bit about that in the first presentation. Modern citizenship education in Korea was first introduced under the US Army military government. There was civic education under the authoritarian regimes, but democratic governments since the 1990s quickly abandoned anti-communist and authoritarian styles of citizenship education, and at the same time revised the national curricula to promote liberal democratic citizenships. However, 2 notable factors have influenced the dynamics of citizenship education in South Korea since the turn of the century. The first one is the back and forth between conservative and progressive or liberal administrations with different emphasis on democratic citizenship education. That's the liberal progressive paradigm, and moral character education, which is the conservative civic education paradigm. Second, rapid shifts in both global and domestic contexts led to a demand for a new form of citizenship education in South Korea, which is not necessarily rooted in the nation-state base. And that is the global citizenship education. And South Korea, interestingly, has positioned itself as a global leader in global citizenship education. And if we look, for example, at the results of the International Comparative Citizenship Studies 2009 and 2016, then we see that there has been a substantial increase, not only in civic knowledge, but also in participatory activities by students who have been subject of civic education. So the reforms seem to lead to a change in civic behavior and civic attitudes among Korean students. And finally, civic education in Germany. The German model of civic education emerged, of course, after World War II in West Germany and was transferred then, since 1990, to East Germany. It emphasizes the development of curricula for democratic citizenship in accordance with what's called the concept of responsible citizens. So it's not about civic knowledge, primarily. It's not about moral character education, but it's about, well, educating responsible citizens, or the German term would be mündige Bürger. That means students are able to make their own decisions in political activities and are able to understand political processes, democratic values, and then they make their decisions based on a responsible choice. In Germany, we have a federal system, of course, and that means there's, on the one hand, the federal government with a federal agency of civic education, which is the main lead public authority providing citizenship education, and then there are the 16 state governments who also have their citizenship education programs, their curricula. But there is a basic consensus among the 16 state governments and the federal government. That's the so-called Beutelsbacher consensus. That means this regulates the basic rules and principles of civic education. So how can civic education contribute to countering polarization? The public expectation is often one of civic educators as 9/11 firefighters. And this is an unwarranted perception or expectation. Civic education, however, can help to socialize students and citizens in mechanisms of democratic judgment and preference formation. It can educate about how democratic legitimacy is created and eroded, and about the fundamental values and principles of democratic societies. Yet a central paradox of civic education in regard to polarization is that teachers and professionals are supposed to motivate young people to adopt certain normative perspectives on the one hand, but at the same time, they are supposed to be normatively neutral, to allow students to develop their own ideas and educational experience. And this paradox, how do you counter polarization in a politically or democratically neutral way? That's a problem, a dilemma for civic education. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say there are certain mechanisms through which civic education can become a potent tool in combating polarization within societies. And I think I'm running out of time, so let me real quick skim through those. Critical thinking and media literacy, encouraging dialogue and civil discourse, strengthening democratic values, promoting active citizenship, teaching conflict resolution skills, and building social cohesion and social capital, where we talked about in the first presentation in this panel. So let me sum up. Polarization is a phenomenon that's relevant for civic education, but civic education faces a dilemma or paradox. How do you counter polarization if you want to develop responsible citizens? Civic education in the context of democratic education and countering polarization is not about creating loyal subjects, it's about creating responsible citizens. And that's my last point, citizenship education has a long-term aspect, a long-term function. It cannot counter polarization in the short term. It's not a short-term fix, it's a long-term solution, or maybe a long-term mechanism to solve issues of democratic backsliding and polarization. Thank you so much.
And moving swiftly on, we're going to have the third presenter in this panel is my colleague from Ewha Graduate School of International Studies, Professor Hannah-Jan.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm Hannah-Jan with the Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Women's University. My major area of research and teaching is actually, oh, this is not my slide. There we go. My major area of teaching and research is sustainability as well as environmental social governance issues, so ESG issues, especially how investors can blend ESG elements into investment decisions and how corporations can better disclose and manage ESG risks within their business. It's always difficult to follow such very passionate presentations, and I have the added pressure of trying to finish before lunch, which I know that you all want to enjoy, so I'll be moving along and hopefully sharing some of my experience over the years, kind of more on the ground with my specific course, Sustainability Reporting and Analysis. I'll be talking about 5 major parts very briefly. So why sustainability? Second is what are some of the challenges we face when trying to embed sustainability into the curriculum. I'll look at our pedagogical tool, which is the WikiWit platform. You probably may not have heard of, but I'd be happy to introduce. And I'll be looking at kind of some of the shifts in the evolution of my own course. And I think this goes back to Dan's comment earlier about, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. So some things out of our control that actually help to enhance, I hope, the course. And then I'll finish with concluding remarks. Okay, so why we're talking about sustainability at all? Within our own panel, you've heard some of these major themes that are being talked about. And I think the great thing is it provides a kind of common language for all of us, regardless of which country or economy or economic development state that we start with. And so when we talk about sustainable development here, we can go back to the Brundtland Commission of 1984, looking at development that meets the needs of the present, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In other words, we need to do better, maintain our resources, think about the environment, society, governance issues for today, so that our children's generation and the generations after won't suffer. And so, as mentioned by our illustrious dean, Professor Brendan Howe, he did talk about the Millennium Development Goals as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. And so really, this is kind of encapsulating the global development agenda. So when we talk about the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, this was between 2000 and 2015, and they predominantly targeted more developing economies. And so looking at the most pressing development issues of the time. And so we had, of course, basic quality education, but you also had a lot of health needs as well, child mortality, I believe, as well as some maternal care and so forth. And so this really focused on basic development needs. And then this has shifted and expanded to encompass a broader range of 17 goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the SDGs. And the major idea with the SDGs was kind of twofold. One is that we have development needs that are present in any economy, regardless of level of economic development. In the United States, in Korea, in Thailand, we all have issues with, for example, quality education, poverty. We have issues with climate, decent work, and so forth. And so this is much more inclusive than before. And then the second one is that we can also focus on harnessing partnerships. And I think that's a real key, not only to our panel, but also to the work that everyone here is doing. So this is kind of extended into why we need sustainability education. And so this is based on some collaborative research that I've been very fortunate to be involved in the past few years. And we looked at what are some of the main benefits of blending sustainability into our predominantly university curricula. And these are 3 major areas, the first being knowledge, the second being skills, and then the third being attitudes, so enhancement in attitudes. I won't go everything here. We have a paper I'd be happy to share with you regarding this. But the idea is that, especially for our own students, it not only enhanced their knowledge and their skills and their awareness, but I think not just going for kind of a focus on learning or knowledge, but trying to change behavior and going to more sustainable consumption patterns. And I think very happily, it's also extended even further outside of the classroom. We've had many more students who have picked up these skills and became very passionate about ESG sustainability social responsibility, and this has actually opened up a lot of employment opportunities for our students in international organizations, in consulting, research institutions, and also ESG data analytics. And so hopefully this is also beneficial at a very kind of tangible level. Now, a lot of the case studies that you see about trying to blend sustainability in education say it's very beneficial to blend sustainability into education. The challenge is, how do we actually go about doing that? And there have been less studies out there, this study excluded, that try to talk about what are some of the practical challenges facing instructors. How do we actually go about blending sustainability into the curricula? We've tried to focus on a few major kind of obstacles or challenges when it came to sustainability education. The first one is sustainability, of course, is very complex. It requires a lot of expertise, a lot of skills. Initially, when we start to try to blend sustainability into the curricula, it tends to be quite superficial. So maybe there's a 15-week course and we have one course, 1 week that looks at sustainability. Sustainability is important, and that kind of fizzles out. I think a lot of that can also be attributed to there's a lot of pressure on the instructors because we might not be coming from backgrounds where we're sustainability experts. So we're very passionate and we think that sustainability is important, but we might not have the tools ourselves or the expertise ourselves to embed that. Another related issue, and I should have highlighted in red, but it also has to do with kind of institutional support. Do you have that kind of institutional buy-in from your universities and from your departments and programs to actually roll this out? And so that's an important kind of obstacle we need to think about. The second one is also curricular limitations. So we tend to have, even at the university and the graduate level, curriculum, it tends to be very lecture-based, kind of one-way teaching. Not all of you, I'm sure. Everyone here is very engaging with your students, but it does tend to feel more like a lecture as opposed to taking that and then turning that into behavioral change on the part of students. And so, yes, I think a lot of that could also be, the onus of that is on the instructors as well. And then the third one has to do with tools and implementation. What are the tools available? We might not know what's available out there. But another challenge is we might have the tools available, but we don't really know how to implement those into the curriculum. And so hopefully with regards to this, I can share a little bit from my own humble experience with one of my courses. I also mentioned here tools and methods can also change. And again, going back to Dan and your comment about COVID, and unfortunately it might not be the last kind of challenge we face in education, but I think that we can use that as maybe a happy event for us to kind of tool and re-equip our own courses. So this is the pedagogical tool that we actually use for my course, and this is called WikiRate. I know when you think of wiki, you think of Wikipedia, which is a no-no in most of your courses. You cannot cite Wikipedia in advanced research. The idea is kind of similar though. We have a platform where we're trying to pool together ESG sustainability data. And the way that we do that is we have to extract the data from sustainability reports and put that onto the system. And so what our students can actually engage in the first half of the class is trying to figure out what the data actually says. What data is available? To what extent are corporations actually disclosing sustainability information? And so they literally pick specific industries targeting specific SDGs, and you look at their years and years of sustainability reports and pick the data and the metrics that are aligned with the Global Reporting Initiative. And so I like to think of it as learning. Students often think of it as labor, but I think they kind of go hand in hand. And as they're trying to find the data, what they realize is, oh, we thought that the report looks beautiful, and it sounds like they're doing a lot, but when it comes to actually figuring out what specific and tangible contributions are being made, what is being quantified, you actually find that there's not a lot of information available. And so that's another key finding for our students as they're going through this report. Otherwise, they might not have known, if they hadn't done the learning or labor. And then the second part is, once you have that data, how can we make sense of that data based on what these corporations and this industry has been doing with respect to this SDG? What are the tangible contributions that are being made? Okay. This is kind of what it looks like from a student's perspective as you're inputting data. My goal in the first part of the class is, after they're doing their labor-intensive data kind of inputs, I have to make sure that what they input is accurate. So I'm looking at accuracy, I'm looking at completeness of the data, and I'm also looking at timeliness. And I'm able to monitor this through the WikiRate platform. And then if you want to look at specific companies, you can also extract the data and come up with these beautiful charts afterwards. If you're interested in how many different universities from around the world have been able to use WikiRate in their own classrooms, I would like to guide you to this, and it should be made available out there. And this was done with WikiRate as kind of a center, also really led by the University of Wollongong in Australia with Dr. Stephanie Perkis, and you'll also see Ewha Women's University as well, and how you can cater that to both undergraduate as well as graduate courses and from different majors. So most recently, and this is the last kind of major topic before I finish for today, originally I had done everything within our four walls of our university, and that had been more than sufficient. And again, I've been really happy with the results. And so the first half, of course, is the traditional kind of model. We had the data inputs as well as the data kind of analysis. So to what extent is data being disclosed? And based on this data, what contributions are actually being made? Now, the challenge came in with the final output, or kind of the final deliverable for the class. Initially, it was a student presentation. So your students would come up and they would give a presentation within their group of 3 and 4. And that was kind of how the semester ended. Then COVID happened. And so everything turned online. We had no class together anyways to begin with. And the thought of having a virtual kind of student presentation was very daunting for me as an instructor, very daunting for our students. And what we found was that with Zoom, it's really easy just to read a script. And sometimes the presentations might be smoother, but you get the idea that perhaps the information, the insights are not really being well digested and therefore not really being communicated well. And so what ended up happening was we switched to a final deliverable being a 5 to 10 minute video that sums up the insights to an audience that might be familiar with sustainability, but may not be an expert in this area. And that really forced the students to not only understand the findings from their own data analysis, but also how best to communicate that visually to a wider audience. Now, the challenge was at our Graduate School of International Studies, we are experts in many things, but unfortunately data, design, visualization, video, some of these technical aspects are not part of it. And so I was able to very fortunately collaborate this past semester with Tongsu University, which is based in Busan in South Korea. And the reason I chose Tongsu University is because inside connections. I'm very fortunate to know the director of their SD4G Center, so Social Design for Good. And Tongsu University, which might not be as well known, is very well known in the fields of visualization design, actually getting that either animated, also in terms of music, and these technical skill sets that we really didn't have at Ewha for that particular semester. And so what we did was more labor. And some of our students, they had the top 2 groups within our team, within our class, they were given the opportunity for an extra workshop. And so it's like 15-week traditional semester plus 2 days in Busan. And that was meant to be a prize. And so what we ended up doing was taking the final outputs by our own Ewha students, and we actually enhanced those outputs in collaboration with Tongsu University. And so you see us looking very happy over here. This is part of the blended kind of internal work that we had done, just introducing my counterpart over at Tongsu University. He had also, Dr. Yonggi Lee, he was also very helpful in picking the final teams that would be coming to Busan. So we did have some interaction over the semester. I think what we're hoping is next semester, yes, it'll actually be next semester, we'll be able to acquire more budget so that we can actually have all of our students collaborate earlier on, and not just us going to another university, but hopefully some of their students can also come to our university to interact more closely. And these were some of the enhanced outputs. I was trying to figure out a way to put video in here, but again, I might need more technical expertise. I'm very happy to share some of our students' outputs if you're interested in doing so, so please feel free to connect with me afterwards. I didn't get a time warning, thank goodness. So maybe I'll finish with concluding remarks. The first being that collaboration in sustainability education is very helpful, especially because sustainability itself is so complex. Collaborations can also take many different forms. The one that I had been engaged in was a lot of inter-university collaborations at the local level with Tongsu University, also at the international level with a group of our counterparts. I do, later, if you're interested, initially I was thinking of intra-university. So if you have a large university, you have many different departments. Surely I could have gone to our media and communications department within our own university. A big challenge that comes to the third point, and that can also be language of instruction. So at our Graduate School of International Studies, everything is in English, but for the remaining departments, it's a mix of, well, predominantly Korean language, and then maybe a little bit of English language as well. And so rather than trying to coerce some of our other departments into working with our English speaking students, I approached a counterpart who had a similar program, but designed for kind of visualization. Last but not least, key considerations that you might want to think about if you're hoping to blend sustainability into your curriculum. There might be different approaches you can take if you're teaching, for example, large undergraduate courses versus smaller, more intense graduate level courses, as well as your learning objectives. There are some examples where, especially if it's kind of more advanced seminars, you would come up with research outputs, publications and so forth, as opposed to something more creative that we might have tried in my own class. Class size would also play a role. Language of instruction, as I mentioned. Data availability. So the challenge, I think, for WikiRate is because we have to verify the data that goes onto the platform. The reports that are available must be available in English. And so if there are language difficulties with some of the corporations within your own country, those are some considerations you might want to think about. Last but not least, funding is always very important. How much, this might have to do with institutional buy-in, what university supports, you can track automatically with how much they're willing to spend on this particular program. So in terms of funding, the collaboration ended up being very, spur of the moment. It was kind of a moment of inspiration, but we were very fortunate for Tongsu University and their center and kind of the upper echelons who are very happy to sponsor these types of collaborations. Again, hopefully for next time we can get even more so that more students can be just as inspired along with their labor to pursue sustainability. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to passing the baton on to our next speaker.
So our final speaker for this panel is Dr. Hyukmin Kang, who is a postdoc researcher at Ewha Graduate School of International Studies. And after his presentation, we should still have a few minutes for Q&A and discussion. So I'll invite all the panel to come up and sit at the table after Dr. Kang's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kang Hyukmin, as introduced. And I have to apologize all of you because we have, traveled all the different things about different topics about education, and I invite you completely different topic about victims of political violence as an agent for peace education in post-conflict societies. I am sure many of you are aware of the issue of post-conflict reconstruction or peace building and transitional justice after mass killing and genocide and etc. Many states in Southeast Asia also experience this, as well as in South Korea too. I have to tell about my story of this research. It was 2019 when I was still researching about my doctoral thesis, interviewing here and there, and pretty much focused on South Korea home. I was interviewing victims of violence, of civilian massacres during the Korean War. And I have interviewed over 100 individual victims during the semi-focused, semi-structured interview and focus group interview and etc. And I got an impression that the previous studies about victimology or peace-building studies have a strong recognition that victims of violence are always vulnerable, incapable of being subjective, playing in subjective role in political process or peace process and peace building and etc. But my finding and my feeling was at the time, no, victims are more capable of rearranging themselves than we have expected. And it was 2019 that I have realized that, so I was lucky enough that I could perform a case study in education setting. Before further ado, I would like to ask one question. What kind of pedagogic effects can emerge from peace education when victims of violence play a role in teaching at public school? As I said, I was researching about transitional justice and peace building in the context of post-conflict societies. More and more peace building scholars are focused on peace education. Okay, peace education is very important for sustainable peace. What then about peace education scholars do in post-conflict societies? They do research heavily on theories and case studies of integral relations for reconciliation and restorative justice and etc. And more critical scholars, they started to focus on agentic roles of teachers and school curriculums and culture and etc. My interest was, what about victims? What about we bring those victims, to the educational setting and letting them to speak about their experiences as a transformative moment or education. So I invited 5 victims in South Korea, and I conducted an experiment in 3 different public schools. It was middle school in Gyeonggi province and circling Seoul. But before taking into the research findings, I'm talking about victims of violence in South Korea. So I cannot explain details about what happened in Korea, but it was exactly same what happened in Indonesia during in 1960, and also Greece like 100 years back, and also in Spain. Especially the South Korean government have conducted mass killings after the Japanese colonialism and during even the Korean War, and tens of people, civilian people, were killed by state forces. And victims and surviving family members, they have been marginalized. They were silenced for the last 70 or 80 years thus far. And the transitional justice mechanism has started about like 30 years ago, and then they are able to finally to speak about their stories and their suffering and etc. But still, this kind of atmosphere and the process is still ongoing. There are many a number of victims silenced up to date. So the method that I used was participant observation. I invited 5 victims, internet connection. I have known some teachers at public school and middle school, and I asked the teachers to conduct this kind of program called Learning from Victims. It was practiced in 2019, and 3 public middle school in Gyeonggi province, South Korea. And overall 5 victims and 92 middle school students participated in classes, 2 times of classes per school, and audio recording, field note, and following interviews were performed to collect data. And now I'm presenting 3 outcomes out of this experience. But I have to tell you that in the first, I want to compare this case study to different post-conflict societies, including Aceh, Indonesia, and Cambodia. So I collected the data and I suggested to my previous colleagues, and let's do this together. Let's have the comparison study. But it was 2019, and after that was COVID-19, so they couldn't, perform this practice. And I'm still waiting for them to practice this. And if you're interested in this project, please come after the presentation and let's talk about this. So one of the victims said, it was very first time I told my stories to the public. I feel very satisfied after teaching. I hope we can continue this education activity. Students seem perplexed somehow, but it's a good thing, I guess. Despite an uncomfortable history, they as Koreans need to know it. What about the students' responses? Overall, in fact, I was a bit amazed by the fact that we have not known about the painful history and these people's suffering. And I didn't know how the state can be so brutal to its citizens. I feel worried about it if the kind of violence would occur ever again. There was, like just a snapshot of their responses, both from victims and students. And I have analyzed, this case study, and there are 3 different findings that occur. The first one is co-construction of critical narratives, such as, what was that? The victim's story at first allowed students to rethink the function of the state. This kind of educational setting allowed both victims and students to think about the roles and functions of the state. But at the same time, they make some anti-war narratives. They question about the power, the state power. They question about why do we need wars. So overall, they co-constructed the contents of the education. So very critical narratives, anti-war narratives, and they also talk about human rights of victims and their suffering and etc. After, and also like justice and truth need to be revealed and accomplished and the kind of thing. The second one is education for social emotion. I was identified with this finding from Aceh and Cambodia as well, which means that this kind of education testing allowed especially students to have the sense of a social emotion of suffering and injustice. South Korea, present time, students are really young and they have not known about what has happened before even the Korean War and during the Korean War. And they know not about the historical fact, but about their social emotion collectively formed. So they could, have an empathy, an anger, and also disappointment to the states and those who are responsible for the violence. I think it's very important for us, all of us, to remember about social emotion. We can share social emotion with the students in this specific form of education. Last but not least, education as a social acceptance and resilience. So this kind of a setting of education does not only for students, but also victims themselves. There are many different literature talk about post-traumatic growth or altruism born of suffering, like about pro-social activism after violence, which means that how victims can become a subjective agent for peace building and reconciliation and justice. Of course, they have been, silenced for the last 7 or 3 decades, but now they have safe place to speak about their story. They feel about, students, they accept our story. You feel like the society, whole society accepts our presence and also our suffering and etc. So it has a function for rehumanizing, for resilienceing victims. However, there are some limitations I have found. The first one is the quality and contents of classes are highly dependent on victims' capacity and victims' view on the violence and their way of telling their stories. So there was one victim who was highly traumatized, and he was even not even really talking his story. He was just sitting beside, and I was just nodding or just, the kind of very passive inaction kind of attitudes during the classes. But at the time, I didn't know how to deal with this kind of situation. So I wanted to, encourage him to participate in the process. But, I have to acknowledge there was, there are some limitations on it. And also generation gap between students and victims, because they are mainly 70 or 80s in their age. And the students were sort of teenagers. And the generation gap, students do not talk with their grandparents often in South Korea, And then, they didn't know how to deal with this gap. They're talking, but I don't know how to react to this, right? The third one is learning from victims is a very eventful education thing. So it is really difficult to continue. I feel like, my case study is very, like limited in numbers. So I wanted to continue about this education event, but I couldn't do because of the COVID-19. And afterward, I lost the connection with the teachers. So I was, asking for other teachers, but it is really unlikely to happen again. So I feel, I don't know, very sad about this. That's why I am asking other colleagues and, collect some data and then compare together South Korean case, probably other societies. I didn't come to the conclusion because, I don't want to come to conclude, but I want to invite all of you, if you're interested in this project, and please come to me and let's talk about this. And yes, these are the references, and thank you very much.
So I think we have around about 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion of the wide range of interdisciplinary issues that we've raised in this panel. So we've got all our panelists back up here, ready to answer any questions you may have.
Hello, I have the question about sustainability. If I understood you correctly, when you were talking about sustainability, you said you were crossing a lot of borders between disciplines, between universities, between departments. What was the main challenge, and how did you deal with that challenge of crossing borders?
Thank you very much for the question. Maria? Yes, we met in the hallway. We were in the elevator together. Thank you so much. When it comes to the initial collaboration with the many universities, the collaboration was actually the research collaboration. And so we all conducted our own courses separately. And then afterwards, we had pooled those findings together to share about, the different formats that they can take and some of the shared challenges as well as the opportunities that were presented. And so in that respect, it was more kind of, post-learning and collaboration. And that I think helped to enhance how we conducted our courses afterwards. The most recent one was with Dongso University. And I think the biggest challenge, but we anticipated, was because we are at Ewha, our expertise was in the sustainability data and the analysis. Dongso's side was the technical skills. The challenge was because of limited budget and time, we had actually had the collaboration towards the end of the semester. And so our students knew that they were going to take these findings and enhance the visual aspect, but it took some time for the students at Dongso to understand the sustainability aspect. And so I think for them, they had the technical skill sets, but they weren't sure, for example, who is our audience? What type of emotion do we want to convey? Is this meant to be serious? Is this meant to be informative, entertaining? It took some time to understand the kind of the philosophy behind it, in addition to some of the technical aspects. So what is the data that we want to highlight? How do we make that relatable to an audience that might not know about scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? And so hopefully for next next semester, we would like to have the collaboration much earlier on, so that they're on board with the sustainability aspect and we're on board with how we can actually visualize that more effectively earlier on, so that we don't suffer so much later when we actually do collaborate with one another. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
I guess I'm the next one asking questions. So I'm Olivia from Xi'an Liverpool University, and I also have a question about sustainability for Dr. Jing, because I'm working on also mapping very painfully of sustainability into the curriculum, and I totally agree with you. It could be superficial and it could be ticking the box. So I have a question. So you mentioned that this is a final assessment. And for your students, the focus is on sustainability, and the other group of students, their focus is more, their skill set is more technical. I wonder if you have, when they are assessed, their work, it's collaboratively produced, are they assessed differently with different criteria? And also with AI, generative AI, I've already experimented with a lot of students that collaborated with me and my instructional designers. And we found that the tool can create videos pretty efficiently, and some of them have pretty good, representations. So when did you, when you were doing that project, did you get into this AI aspect into play? Because in some of our assessment, it used to be, okay, in one presentation, like you mentioned, if it was done face-to-face, and then the visual aspect takes a bit of a chunk, and then there was debate in many departments and say, okay, when students use AI to do it, do we get credit for students to use that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll answer quickly, but it's a huge discussion we can have later. In terms of the evaluation, our evaluation criteria for the Ewha side has always been the same. And so the first part is always the accuracy of the data, completeness of the data, and the timeliness of the data. And then the second part is how we actually analyze the contributions, of the corporate contributions and for this industry with respect to the SDG. In terms of the actual presentation of the data, we acknowledge that we are not experts in design and visualization. And so as long as we're able to follow, so it doesn't have to be beautiful and expert level. It's much more about the analysis and the ideas behind the visualization, and as long as the visualization isn't distracting, and so it actually kind of helps along. For the Dongsa side, because the collaboration came after the semester, it was actually more kind of like extra credit for the Dongsa students. We gave them pizza and we made lifelong friendships. But for them, it was already after their semester had ended, and so it was kind of social contribution on their side, and a lot of begging from my counterpart at Dongsa University. But hopefully next time, I think we're looking at ways how they can evaluate the visualization aspect more on their side, and to help in the storytelling, rather than focusing on the sustainability side, which is not the core element of their course. But that's a great question and something that we're thinking about as well. The same for AI. This is also another post kind of COVID thing, this is the first year that I've had to deal with what do you do with AI generated voices or images. Does that still count as student credit? It's still a small enough class where I see their progress every week, and they're meant to at the very least disclose whether or not they're using AI in their presentations. I still don't have a good answer for that. I do like to say that even generating good AI takes good prompts, and so that's also a skill. At the same time, I think there's a lot of value in trying to do the major kind of groundwork by themselves and for the students, even if it's not visually perfect. And so we'll continue to talk afterwards, and thank you for the question.
Thank you. This question is for Aurel. Actually, we had a little mini discussion last night, and I may have been more intractable about engaging in polarization at that time. So my question to you is, because one of the comments you made was like the far right versus everyone else, even within their own right
political reality. So my question to you is, how do we bridge that gap with that level of extremity if we're supposed to address this polarization issue?
Well, that's obviously a very important question. As with all important questions, the answer is difficult. So obviously, I mean, number one, I guess civic education can be only one of many tools or mechanisms you can use or you should use in order to try to bridge the gap between the different camps in a polarized society. Number two is, of course, it's a long-term process. And number three, I think, because if we talk about political polarization, political elites are key. And what we know from decades of polarization in democracies and the collapse of democracy, the key are not so much the illoyal elites, those who want to further polarize society in order to establish political dominance. The key are the semi-loyal elites, those who are sitting on the fence and are not sure, should we join polarization, should we fight against polarization, should we defend democracy and pluralism, or should we try to abolish and weaken pluralism? So the semi-loyal elites are the key. To fight polarization, political elites are just really important. Second or third, intellectual elites are really important. Intellectual elites in academia, in media, intellectual elites in arts, and so on and so forth. Because they are the multiplicators that actually can mediate or intensify polarization. And number four, last point is, every polarized society has some structural issues. There are some structural causes for polarization. And you cannot deal effectively with polarization without dealing with these structural causes. And it's not, I think, a coincidence that polarization today in many societies, not so much in Thailand, but in the US or in Germany and other Western societies, has a lot to do with identity issues. And probably you have to take their identity concerns serious.
We apparently have time for one more short question, please, and you'll receive a short answer from whoever you address.
Good morning. You are working with the collaborations for sustainability. So, what is the criteria of, to make the collaborations, and what type of institutions, what type of students or institutions will make collaborations?
Oh, wonderful. Mala?
Malla Reddy
Yes,
from
that's right.
Karimnagar.
And so I think the bar is actually quite low. The first bar is actually passion for sustainability, and you know, well, actually that might be a high barrier actually, and a real willingness to embed that into the curriculum, and a lot of that comes with. The reason it started, I think, initially with WikiRate is these were all instructors who had met in Berlin. I think there was an international conference on social responsibility, and WikiRate was there, and they were looking for collaborators, and that was kind of the initial kind of nucleus. Going afterwards, it really is that dedication, and it's a very hard word to kind of make more tangible, but also to a certain extent, institutional support for that. And so, at least for our program, we have a lot more flexibility in terms of course development and how we can embed those concepts. And the last one is get in touch with me, and then we can try to work something out. Thank you.